In the reed-choked marshes of the Nile Delta, where the water lies flat and brown between the papyrus stems, the goddess Isis kneels in the early hush, and upon her head she carries a throne. It is not a crown of gold or a circlet of stars. It is the shape of a seat, the very sign that scribes drew to spell her name. The reeds bend a little in the slow air. The river moves without sound. She kneels as though listening for something beneath the surface of the world, and the throne upon her brow catches the first grey light, marking her as the goddess in whom kingship itself is cradled. If these ancient stories help you rest, subscribe, so the next story can find you at bedtime. The Egyptians wrote her name with that throne-shaped mark, and the old word for a throne sounded almost like her name when spoken aloud, as though the seat of the king and the goddess were two echoes of a single breath. So she wears the royal seat as her emblem, the place where a ruler sits made into a living crown. And here, in the quiet of these marshes, the night sets down its one small mystery, the question it will turn over slowly and gently until it comes to rest. How does a grieving widow gather the scattered pieces of a murdered king and, from that sorrow, breathe kingship itself back into the world? Hold that question loosely, the way one holds water in an open hand. It will not be answered all at once. Now let the marsh widen in the mind, and let her many shapes come forward, for she is not one thing only. She is the sister and the wife of Osiris, the good king whose story waits ahead. She is sister as well to Set, lord of the desert and the storm, and to Nephthys, the quiet keeper of the house of mourning. She is the mother of Horus, the falcon child who will one day claim a throne. And beyond all these bonds of kinship, she is a goddess whose magical power was said to surpass that of every other god, a power woven of spoken words and true names, and a will that does not break. From queen she will become widow. From widow she will become a mourner who walks the length of a whole land searching. From that searching she will rise as a divine mother, and at last as the compassionate healer whom ordinary Egyptians, sick or frightened or grieving, would call upon in the dark. That is the long road this telling will walk. Before we follow her along that road, it is worth kneeling for a moment where the historians kneel, at the edge of what can truly be known. For all her later greatness, Isis comes to us out of a deep silence. Neither she nor Osiris is named in any writing that survives from before the 5th dynasty of Egypt, a span of years reaching roughly from 2494 to 2345 before the Common Era. There is a single inscription that may reach back a little further still, to the reign of a king called Niuseri-Ini, though even that is offered with a careful hand, a possibility rather than a certainty. The name flickers at the threshold of record, half seen, like a figure at the far end of a dim hall. Then, at the close of that same dynasty, she appears plainly at last, carved into the walls within the pyramids of kings. These are the pyramid texts, the oldest body of sacred writing Egypt has left to us, cut into stone so that the words might guard the dead ruler on his passage. In them Isis stands clear, already bound to Osiris, already part of the great story of loss and return. Yet the scholars add a gentle caution here, and it is worth keeping. The carving of the words came late, but the words themselves may have lived far longer in the mouths of priests, spoken and remembered across generations before any chisel touched the stone. So her beginnings may be older than her earliest record, an inheritance already worn smooth by use when it was first written down. And where did that inheritance take root? The old passages point toward the delta, toward the low green country near the places later called Bahbet el-Hagar and Sebenitos, out among the marshes where this telling began. There, it seems, her cult first drew breath, in the reed country of the north, before it spread through all of Egypt and, in the long ages to come, far beyond it. There remains the matter of the throne she wears, for it has puzzled learned minds, and the puzzle is part of her, because her name was written with that seat-shaped sign. A scholar named Kurt Sether once proposed that Isis had begun as something more elemental than a goddess, with a family and a face. He suggested she had first been the royal throne itself, made holy, a personification of the very seat upon which a king was made a king. Another scholar, Henri Frankfort, took up this thought and shaped it further. He called the throne the mother of the king, made divine. In his reading, the throne was no dead furniture, but a power, the force that lifts an ordinary man and sets him among rulers, the lap that holds the sovereign as a mother holds a child. By such an account, the woman kneeling in the marsh was once the seat of power grown into a person, and every king who sat upon a throne sat, in a sense, upon her. It is a beautiful idea, and an old one, and the night offers it as tradition and theory, nothing firmer, for other scholars have looked at the same evidence and shaken their heads. Jürgen Ossing and Klaus Kuhlmann pointed to the small, stubborn differences between the sound of her name and the sound of the word for throne, differences that do not sit easily with so tidy a story. And they noted a plainer trouble still. There is no clear sign that any throne was ever worshipped as a god in Egypt. No altar to the empty seat, no offerings laid before the chair alone. So the origin of Isis remains uncertain, a door left ajar rather than shut. Perhaps she was the throne made living. Perhaps the throne upon her head is only her sign, a mark of what she guards and gives, rather than what she once was. The old sources do not force the matter, and neither will we. It is enough, for now, to see her wearing the seat of kings, and to let the reason for it stay a shade unresolved, the way many true things do. What can be said with more confidence is the family into which she was born, for the Egyptians set her within a great and ordered lineage. Isis belonged to the Ennead of Heliopolis, a company of 9 deities reckoned to descend from the Creator himself. At the head of that line stood Atum, whom many also named Ra, the one who brought the world up out of the first waters and set the pattern of all that followed. From him came the generations, one giving rise to the next in a chain of making, until the cosmos stood arranged from sky to soil. Near the base of that descent came Geb and Nut, the earth and the heavens, he the ground, and she the arching dark above it, sown with stars. And to Geb and Nut were born the last generation of that divine house, 4 children who would carry the weight of the story yet to come. There was Osiris, gentle and kingly. There was Set, restless as the desert wind. There was Nephthys, keeper of thresholds and of grief. And there was Isis, 4 siblings, born of earth and sky, standing at the end of the long line of creation, like the final words of a sentence the cosmos had been speaking since the beginning. In such a lineage the world found its order, each god set in a place, each place bound to the next, and above and through it all the principle the Egyptians called Ma'at, the balance that holds the stars in their courses and the seasons in their turning, and the just king upon his seat. Yet even here, in this careful arrangement, in this quiet family of earth and sky, something uneasy was already present. 2 brothers stood among those 4 children, and they were not alike. One was made for the throne, and the flooding of the fields, and the green return of the grain. The other was made for the red sands, and the sudden storm, for the edges of things, for disorder. They were brothers, and the peace between them was a peace that could be broken. For now, the marshes remain still, and Isis kneels among the reeds with the throne upon her head, sister and wife and mother, and mistress of magic, a figure standing at the meeting place of a great lineage and a coming sorrow. The river slides past without hurry. The papyrus leans and straightens in the breath of the morning, all that she will become, the searching and the mourning and the making of a king out of grief, waits just beyond the edge of the light, folded into the days that have not yet arrived. And the question set down at the water's edge waits with it, patient, unhurried, willing to be answered slowly. Before the sorrow, though, there was a kingdom, and a good king to rule it, and a peace that seemed as though it might hold forever. Authority among the gods, as the Egyptians told it, passed down the male line, and so the crown came at last to Osiris, the gentle son of Geb and Nut, and he became king of the living land. Isis, his sister and his wife, stood beside him as queen, and the 2 of them together held the seat that the story had been reaching toward since the first waters parted. To look upon Osiris in the old images is to see kingship itself given a body. He wears the long plaited beard of the pharaoh, narrow and formal, the sign of a ruler and of something older than any single ruler. His legs are wrapped as a mummy is wrapped, bound close in linen, so that even in the fullness of his reign, he carries the look of one who has passed through death and holds still. Upon his head rises the tall Atef crown, a pale conical shape flanked by feathers, lifting his stature toward the sky. In his crossed hands, he holds the crook and the flail, the shepherd's curved staff and the threefold whip, the one to gather and the other to winnow, the tools of a keeper who both leads his people and separates the good grain from the chaff. He was among the first of the gods to be joined in Egyptian thought with the wrapping of the mummy, the linen, and the ordered binding, and this is worth holding in the mind, for it will matter later when the linen is not a crown's ornament, but a widow's labor. In his reign the fields flooded and drew back and greened again. The river kept its measure. The grain rose and was cut, and rose once more. This turning, this reliable return of water and harvest, the Egyptians gathered under a single word, Mat. And it is a word this whole story turns upon. Mat was the order of things, the balance that keeps the stars along their tracks, and the seasons in their round, and the just king upon his throne. It was truth and rightness, and the fitting arrangement of the world, all at once. Under Osiris and Isis, that order stood whole and unbroken, and the land rested within it, as a sleeper rests within a quiet house. What follows is the long account of how that order was torn, and of the woman who set herself to mend it. So the peace held, and while it held, it seemed it might hold always, which is the way of every peace before it breaks. The break came from within the family. Set was the fourth of that generation, brother to Osiris and to Isis and to Nephthys, and he was lord of the Red Land, the desert beyond the green margin of the river. He belonged to the dry places, to the sandstorm that erases the road, to the sudden violence of weather and the disorder that lives at the edges of every settled thing. Where his brother was the flood, Set was the drought. Where his brother was the ordered field, Set was the trackless waste. The Egyptians did not make of him a simple villain, for he had his necessary place. He rode in the bark of the sun and drove back the chaos serpent from its prow, and without his strength, the ordered world had its own weakness. Yet strength turned inward becomes a wound, and so it was here. Set turned against Osiris and killed him. The king who embodied Mat was struck down by his own brother, and the throne that had seemed eternal stood suddenly empty. In several tellings, the harm did not end with the killing. Set went further and took the body of Osiris apart, dividing it and scattering the pieces across the length of the land, so that the king was not only dead, but undone, sown like broken seed over the whole of Egypt. It should be said plainly that the sources do not all agree on this. The dismemberment appears in some versions and not in others, and no single Egyptian account gives the whole of the tale in one place. The old texts vary widely, one preserving a detail, another leaves in shadow, but where the scattering is told, it deepens the wound past ordinary death into something like erasure, an attempt to make of the king not merely a corpse, but an absence, pieces without a whole, a name without a form to hold it. This, then, is the injury at the center of everything. This is the death that Isis must answer, and the disorder that the rest of the long story labors to set right. She did not answer it alone. Isis went out to search, and her sister Nephthys went with her, the two of them together crossing the land in grief. Nephthys was called the Lady of the House, keeper of thresholds and of mourning, of the night and the embalming chamber, and where Isis carried the promise of renewal, Nephthys carried the knowledge of death. so that the two sisters between them held both halves of the passage. Along the river they went, following the water that had carried the pieces away, and where the pieces had come to rest, they gathered them. It was slow work and sorrowful work. The length of Egypt walked with mourning as a companion. They were aided by other deities in this searching and gathering, and among them was Anubis, the jackal god of embalming, master of the wrapping and the ointment, the one who knew how a body is made ready and kept. Here, the old stories fold a quiet complication into the tale, and it is worth pausing on. Anubis was often reckoned the son of Nephthys, and in the common telling, his father was said to be Set. Yet the scholar Herman Tevelde doubted that Set was ever truly Anubis's father, and pointed instead to a tradition in which the father was Osiris himself. If that older thread is followed, then the god of embalming who came to help restore the scattered king was helping to restore his own father, and the wrapping of Osiris becomes a son's last service rather than a stranger's craft. The sources do not settle the matter, and we need not settle it either. It is enough to notice how the family closes around its wound, how even the uncertainty draws the mourners nearer to one another. According to the source that names the number, the sisters recovered every part of Osiris save one. The genitalia were not found, lost in the river, or taken by its creatures, gone past finding. All the rest they gathered and brought together, and Anubis and the others worked over the reassembled body, binding it in linen, anointing it, ordering the broken form back toward wholeness. In this careful gathering and rejoining, the Egyptians saw the first pattern of a thing they would practice for thousands of years. The searching sisters, the recovered pieces, the wrapping and the ointment, the making of a scattered body into a single guarded form. All of this became the mythic prototype of mummification, the earthly rite forever shadowing the divine one. Every embalmer bending over the linen was, in a sense, repeating the walk that Isis and Nephthys made along the river, and every wrapped body was Osiris made once more. When the pieces were gathered and the body lay whole upon its bier, the sisters did not leave it. They stood over it together, keeping watch, for the danger was not past. Set might come again to undo their work, to scatter once more what they had drawn together, and so the reassembled king had to be guarded through the vulnerable hours. Isis at one end and Nephthys at the other, the two of them framed the still form between them, and in the old imagination, this pairing took on a shape larger than two grieving women at a bedside. They were likened to the two great towers of a temple gateway, the pylon, those broad sloping masses of stone that rise on either side of a sacred entrance. Between such towers, the Egyptians saw the Achet, the horizon, the notch in the world where the sun goes down into the underworld and climbs back out again at dawn. So the sisters became a living gate. Nephthys, keeper of night and death, stood for the darkness into which the sun descends. Isis, keeper of renewal, stood for the light that returns. And Osiris lay between them, upon the threshold of the horizon, in the very place where ending turns to beginning. held in the narrow passage where night gives way to day. To guard a body is one thing, to call it back is another, and this was the labor that only Isis, with her sister beside her, could attempt. She became in this the very image of the grieving widow, the epitome of mourning, and the Egyptians gave her the fullest voice of sorrow in all their funerary texts. She did not restore Osiris by force or by any single act of power. She restored him through love, through the shared grief of the two sisters mingled over the Bier, and through the recited spells of her great magic, words spoken in the right order, with the right breath, the craft in which she was said to surpass all other gods. The old texts preserve her speeches, and they are not gentle in the way one might expect of a lullaby, for they range across the whole reach of a heart broken open. There is sorrow in them, the plain grief of a wife bent over her husband, naming what she has lost. There is longing in them too, a frank desire that speaks of the marriage bed and calls the beloved back, not only to life, but to her arms. And there is anger in them, a sharpness turned against death itself, against the wrongness of a king laid low, a refusal to accept the silence as the last word. Sorrow and desire and anger, braided together, each of them a different rope thrown across the dark toward the one who has gone, all of them meant to reach the inert body and stir it toward breath again. In the reciting, grief becomes a kind of summoning, and love becomes a kind of magic, and the widow's lament becomes the instrument by which a dead king is drawn back across the threshold. It matters, in the honest telling, to see clearly what this restoration was and what it was not, for the shape of it belongs to the older layer of Egyptian belief. Isis here is the one who assists and awakens. She rouses a potency that is Osiris's own. She does not replace it or stand in its place. The power to father a life remains his, and her spells and her love serve to call that power back into a body that has gone still, rather than to supply it from herself alone. In the long ages that followed, as her cult grew and gathered to itself the traits of many other goddesses, Isis would come to be spoken of in ever greater terms, until she seemed almost the single source of all regeneration. But in this early pattern, she is the awakener at the bedside, the one whose voice and whose grief reach into death and coax the breath back, working upon a life that is not hers to give, but hers to recover. It is a quieter and in some ways a truer marvel, this waking of the dead by morning, and it is the hinge upon which the next part of the story turns. For a king roused from stillness may yet, against all expectation, become a father. The breath returned to Osiris first, or so the old telling has it, a single, slow rising of the chest, where before there had been only stillness. It was not the full return of a living man to the fields and the courts of Egypt, and Isis did not expect it to be. What her spells and her grief had drawn back was a spark, a flicker of the life that had been extinguished, enough to warm the cold body for a little while, enough to let the king exist again in some measure, though the measure was strange and narrow. He lay upon the bier revived and yet inert, present and yet not walking, a husband roused from the far side of death, but not carried all the way home. And Isis, who had labored so long to reach this moment, understood what remained to be done. A king restored to breath, but with no heir, would still be a king whose line ended in silence. The dead needed a future, and the future had to be conceived here, in this thin borderland between the living and the lost. So the goddess who had gathered the scattered king now joined with him, and in that union, tender and grave, and unlike any joining under the ordinary sun, she conceived their son. The texts are frank about it in their own reverent way, for the Egyptians did not shrink from the body when the body was the vessel of a miracle. Here it is worth holding to the older shape of the belief, the truer shape. Isis did not manufacture life out of nothing, nor did she stand as the sole wellspring of all that lives. The potency belonged to Osiris. Her magic had roused it, called it up from the stillness where death had buried it, and in the joining that potency did its own ancient work. She was the awakener, he was the father, and between them, in a body that had known the tomb, a new life took hold. The seed of the next king was sown, not in a palace, but upon a deathbed, and the deathbed became, for one hushed moment, a marriage bed and a cradle at once. From that moment, the shape of things changed for Osiris, and changed for good. He would not rise now to reclaim his throne among the living, to sit again in the halls of Egypt with the crook and the flail in his hands. The breath that Isis had given him was not for that. Having fathered an heir, he could at last go down and stay down. No longer a king robbed of his kingdom, but a king passing into a new one. He descended into the Duat, the underworld, the vast realm beneath the visible world, and there he took a throne that no usurper could ever wrest from him. The dead king became the ruler of the dead. What had looked like the utter defeat of Osiris, murder and dismemberment, and the scattering of his very body, turned in the end into an enthronement in another country, a country to which every mortal would one day travel. He endures there precisely because he has an heir above. A line unbroken in the land of the living lets the Father rest in peace in the land below. And so the two halves of the story lock together, the Son who will grow in the world of the Sun, and the Father who reigns in the world beneath it, each making the other possible. And the future itself, the whole of it, was now gathered quietly in the body of Isis. She carried the heir of Osiris within her, the answer to the murder, the seed of restored order, and she carried it out of the presence of death and back toward the living world, where it would have to be hidden and guarded and grown in secret. The widow had become the mother. The one who wept over the Bier now bore the child who would one day set the wrong to right. She turned from the underworld and its new king and went to find a place where a vulnerable thing might safely come into the world. She found it among the reeds, in the marshes of the Nile Delta, where the great river fans out and slows and loses itself in 100 green channels before it reaches the sea. There grew thick stands of papyrus, taller than a standing man. Those thickets were a world unto themselves, a maze of stems and shadow and still water, loud with the small business of frogs and birds, and the endless soft movement of the reeds in the wind off the water. It was a place easy to enter and hard to search, a place where a hunted creature could vanish. There, in that green concealment, after a pregnancy that ran long and a labor that came hard, Isis gave birth to her son, and she named him Horus. The birth was not easy, and the old telling does not pretend that it was. She labored alone, or nearly alone, in the wet thickets, far from any midwife of the palace, far from the comforts a queen might expect, bringing forth the child in secrecy, because secrecy was the price of his survival. For the boy had an enemy already, before he had drawn his first full breath. Set, his uncle, the murderer of his father, the lord of the Red Land and the deserts and the storms, would not suffer any rival to the throne to live if he could reach him. An infant who was the true heir of Osiris was, to Set, a thing to be destroyed, and so the Papyrus Marsh became a nursery and a hiding place at once, the reeds a curtain drawn between the child and the one who hunted him. The child himself was no ordinary infant, though he came into the world as small and as fragile as any. He was Horus, and the oldest form of Horus was a falcon, a bird of the high air, likely the lanner or the peregrine, keen of eye and swift in the stoop, whose earliest home in worship was Nekhen in Upper Egypt, where he was honored as the guardian god of that place, long before the story of Osiris gathered him into itself. In him the sky itself seemed to be waiting to grow into a king, but for now the falcon was only a nestling, hidden among the water plants, and his mother stood watch over him through the long marsh nights, listening to the reeds, guarding the one small life on which the whole future turned. To guard him was a labor that never ended, for the marsh that hid the child was also full of things that could kill him. The still waters bred fevers, the reeds sheltered serpents whose bite could stop a small heart, and scorpions whose sting could burn the life out of an infant before morning. Isis, who governed the natural world and knew the names and natures of all its creatures, set herself against every one of these dangers, warding the boy with her body and her watchfulness and her magic. And in one of the stories the Egyptians told of this time, she did not keep her watch alone. 7 scorpions traveled with her as her escort and her guard, divine creatures who went where she went. 3 walking before her and 2 at either side, or so the tale arranges them, a small procession of poison turned to her protection. The story of those 7 is among the tenderest the Egyptians preserved, and it turns not on the boy, but on the goddess herself and the reach of her mercy. Isis, in the manner of that story, went among the dwellings of ordinary people, seeking only shelter for the night. She came to the house of a wealthy woman and asked for hospitality, as any weary traveler might, and the woman, seeing perhaps only a poor wanderer with a strange escort, shut her door against the goddess and refused her. Isis passed on without a word of threat, and found rest instead in the humble house of a fishing girl who took her in. But the scorpions had marked the insult. In the night, The seven pooled all their venom into the sting of a single one among them, and that one crept beneath the door of the wealthy woman and struck her child, her own blameless son, who had done nothing and refused nothing. The child sickened at once, the poison of 7 scorpions burning in his small body, and the mother ran through the town, crying out for help, and no one could aid her. It would have been easy, by the reckoning of ordinary justice, to let the proud woman suffer the fruit of her own hardness. But that is not what the goddess did. Isis heard the mother's cry, and her heart moved, not for the woman who had shut the door, but for the child who had never shut it, the innocent caught in the quarrel of his elders. She would not let a blameless boy die for a wrong that was not his. So she came, and she laid her hands upon the sick child, and she spoke the names of the 7 scorpions one by one. For to name a thing is to command it. And she called the venom out of the small body, and bade it fall harmless to the ground. The boy breathed. The fever left him, and the wealthy woman, humbled, gave all she had to Isis, and to the poor girl who had shown the kindness she herself had withheld. There is a whole teaching folded into that little story, and the Egyptians felt it. The goddess who could master death for a king could also stoop to a sick room in a nameless town and lift the poison from a child who was nothing to her. Her mercy was not confined to her own household, to her own divine kin, to the great matter of the throne. It reached down to the smallest and the least, to the child of a woman who had wronged her, and it healed where it might have punished. And in that reaching, the myth touches the place where it entered the daily lives of ordinary people. For this was the Isis that Egyptians called upon when their own children lay sick under their own roofs. Beyond the great cycle of the gods, beyond the murdered king and the hidden heir, Isis lived in the smaller and more constant world of human need, and there she was, above all, a healer. When a child burned with fever, when a scorpion had struck, when a serpent's bite swelled a limb and terror filled a house, it was her name that people spoke over the sufferer, her name written on scraps and worn against the skin, her spells recited by mothers and by the wise men and women who tended the sick. She was said to govern not only the creatures of the natural world, but fate itself, the very unfolding of what was to come, and her magic was reckoned greater than that of any other god, so that to have her on one side was to have the strongest ally that heaven could give. The spells that had roused Osiris from death were the same craft, in kind, as the words that drew poison from a peasant's child. The listener may see how the two belong together, the cosmic and the humble, both of them the work of the same compassionate power, bending down toward what was broken. The Egyptians told of this foreseeing power in another story, older than the tales the Greeks would later gather, preserved in a manuscript scholars call the Westcar Papyrus. In it, Isis appears not as a queen or a mourner, but as a midwife, going with other goddesses to attend the births of 3 children who were destined to become kings of Egypt. She was among those who eased the mothers through their labor, who received the infants as they came into the world, and who, at each birth, spoke aloud the name the child would carry and the destiny that came with it. Barbara Lesko, who studied these things, reads that naming as no small thing. To stand at the threshold of a life and to name the king it will become is to hold a power over what is to come, a power to foresee and perhaps to shape the future itself. So even in the guise of a helper at a bedside, Isis is the one who knows how the story ends, the one whose word settles the fate of kings before they can crawl. And the fate she had settled at one particular birth, in the green secrecy of the marshes, came at last to its reckoning. Horus did not stay a nestling forever. Hidden and guarded and healed of every hurt, the falcon child grew through the seasons into his strength, and when he had come to the fullness of it, he did what he had been born to do. He came out of hiding and stood before the assembled gods and laid claim to the throne of his father, the throne that Set had seized through murder, and he challenged his uncle for the right to rule. The kingship of Egypt had been stolen. Horus meant to take it back. The Egyptians of the New Kingdom told the long story of that quarrel in a tale they called the Contendings of Horus and Set. And it is a strange and winding story, less a single battle than an endless lawsuit, a dispute dragged out before a tribunal of the gods for 80 years and more. The two rivals argued their claims before the divine court. They set each other trials and contests, races upon the water in boats, ordeals of strength and cunning and endurance, each seeking to prove himself the rightful lord and to shame the other before the judges. And through the whole of it, at her son's side, worked Isis. She did not fight Set with spear or fist, for that was not her weapon. She fought with magic and with cunning, with the sharp turning of a word and the shaping of an appearance. And again, it was her wit that swung the divine tribunal toward Horus. She could take on forms not her own, appearing as a grieving widow or a beautiful stranger, to draw an unwary admission from Set's own mouth, laying a trap of speech into which he would step and, in his own words, condemn his own cause. Where the contest turned on strength, she lent her son her craft, and where it turned on judgment, she bent the judgment with her guile, so that her mind became as decisive in the long dispute as any blow struck upon the water. The mother who had hidden the child in the reeds now stood behind the grown man in the council of the gods, and the same power that had guarded a nestling from scorpions now guarded a claimant from being cheated of his crown. The throne of Egypt would be decided in that court, and the wits of Isis were laid upon the scale. Yet the long dispute did not always keep its two rivals apart from the one who bound them. There is a tale told within these very contendings, a dark and difficult thing, in which the quarrel turned for a moment against the mother herself. In the heat of a struggle upon the water, when Isis had used her craft to wound and hobble Set, her son Horus came to believe that she had spared his enemy, that her hand had shown mercy where he wanted none. It is a strange and terrible turn in the story, and the Egyptians who told it did not flinch from it, though they held it as one telling among many rather than the settled truth of things. The severed head did not end her, for she was Isis, and death had never yet been able to hold what she willed to keep. In the place of the head that was lost, she set another, and the head she took up was that of a cow. So the gentle horned beast of the pastures became her own, and from that grafting, the tellers said, came the crown by which later ages would know her best. It was the reason given, in story, for the emblem she would wear upon her brow in the temples of the new kingdom, the broad disk of the sun cradled between two curving horns of a cow. The image was tender, and it was strange at once, a thing of pasture and of heaven joined upon a single head. That headdress, though, was not first her own. It had belonged to another goddess, to Hathor, the great cow of the sky, lady of love and joy and music, and it was from Hathor that Isis received it. Across the long centuries of the New Kingdom, in the age of the great temple builders, roughly 3,500 years ago, Isis drew more and more of Hathor into herself. She took up the horns and the disk. She took up something of the maternal warmth and the sky wideness that had been Hathor's, and she wore them as though they had always been hers. This was the manner of the Egyptian gods, who did not stand apart in tidy separation, but flowed one into another, lending and borrowing their signs and their powers. As Isis absorbed these traits, her standing rose. She had begun as a goddess more at home in the funerary spells and the magical texts than in the ceremonies of the living king, and now she climbed toward the very center of royal worship, gathering to herself the honors of a mother of kings. And it was as a mother that the long contest at last found its end. After the 80 years of ordeal and argument, of races upon the river and trials before the tribunal, of every cunning Isis could bring and every strength Horus could muster, the divine court gave its judgment. The throne of the living was Horus's by right. The throne stolen from his father through murder returned to his father's son. Set was set aside from the kingship he had seized, and the son of Osiris was raised up as lord of Egypt. What had been broken by a brother's crime was mended, and the mending had a name. The Egyptians called it Ma'at, and it was more than the settling of a lawsuit. Ma'at was the right order of all things, the balance of the cosmos, and the justice of the land, woven into a single word, the truth by which the sun rose, and the fields flooded, and the king ruled. Set's murder had torn that order, had let disorder into the world as the desert lord let storms into the green country. And for as long as the throne stood empty of its rightful heir, the wound had stayed open. Now, with Horus crowned, Ma'at was restored. The world was righted upon its old foundation, and the long grief of Isis came round at last to its answer. In that righting something else was completed, quietly, beneath the crowning. The resurrection of Osiris, begun in the marshes when Isis breathed life into his stilled body, was finished only now. For the murdered king did not come back to walk among the living. He kept instead the throne of the dead, ruling in the Duat, the underworld, as lord of that other country from which no season returns. His endurance was of a different kind than the living know. He endured through his son. The child conceived in secret and hidden in the reeds had grown to take the crown, and so the father lived on, not in his own restored body, but in the living heir who sat upon the earthly throne. The dead king reigned below, the living king reigned above, and between them stood the goddess who had made the second possible. Osiris survived death, not by escaping it, but by leaving behind a son, and that son was the gift of the grief and the love and the magic of Isis. From this, the Egyptians drew a truth that shaped the whole of their kingship. If Horus was the model of every living pharaoh, if each king who sat upon the throne was in some sense Horus renewed, then the mother of Horus was the mother of the king himself. Isis became the divine mother of the ruler of Egypt, and this was no distant title. It was carved upon temple walls in an image both intimate and vast. There the pharaoh is shown as a child at the breast of the goddess, drawing her milk, and the milk of Isis was no ordinary nourishment. It was the very sign of his right to rule. To have suckled at that breast was to have been fed on kingship itself, to have taken in with the goddess's milk the divine sanction of the throne. Consider what was gathered in that single image, the king small in the lap of his mother goddess. In her lap the Egyptians felt the earthly throne and the heavenly throne were joined, the seat of the living king below and the eternal seat above, brought together in one embrace. And here the oldest riddle of her name comes gently round. Her name was written with the sign of a throne, and the throne was what she wore upon her head. Some among the learned, the scholar Kurt Sether, foremost among them, proposed that she had begun as the personification of the royal throne itself, the seat made divine, and Henri Frankfort spoke of that throne as a kind of mother of the king, the thing that made a man into a monarch when he sat upon it. Others, Jürgen Osing and Klaus Kuhlmann among them, doubted this reading, finding the name and the word for throne less alike than the theory required, and no certain proof that any throne was ever worshipped as a god. So the origin stays open, a question the sands have not answered. Yet whatever its first root, the throne upon her head found its meaning here, in the lap where kings were nursed. The seat she wore was revealed as the seat of kings, and she who bore it was the one from whom the right to sit upon it flowed. Her worship did not stay small, nor did it stay still. In the Old Kingdom, in the age of the pyramid builders more than 4,000 years ago, Isis had held only a limited part in the rituals of the living king, and a larger place in the texts of the tomb and the spells of the magician. She was a power called upon at the edge of death, and in the hour of sickness, more than in the ceremonies of the court. But across the long stretch of the first millennium before our era, her name rose and rose. She and Osiris became the most widely worshipped of all the gods of Egypt, honored in more shrines and by more people than any others. And as her worship spread, she gathered the traits of many goddesses into herself, until she seemed to hold within her name the powers of a whole company of the divine. Kings raised her temples, and not the kings of Egypt alone. The rulers of Nubia, the land upreach of the great river beyond the southern frontier, built for her as well, and the island of Philae, set in the Nile near that Nubian border, grew into a sanctuary shared across the boundary of peoples. There, on the island in the river, Egyptians and Nubians alike came to honor her, and her temple became one of the enduring centers of her cult, a place where her worship would linger long after much else had faded. The green island, with its columned courts standing above the moving water, was for centuries among the surest homes of her name. And still the name traveled. When the Greeks came into Egypt and made their kingdom there, in the age after Alexander that the learned call Hellenistic, Isis was worshipped by Greek and Egyptian together, joined now to a new god named Serapis, who had been shaped in part to bind the two peoples in a common devotion. The Greeks who took her to their hearts told new things of her. They credited her with the invention of marriage, the ordering of the union between man and woman, and they made her a guardian of those who went down to the sea in ships, a protectress of sailors and of safe voyages across the uncertain water. Her festivals spread with her worship. Among them was the Navigium Isidis, the launching of the ship of Isis, a spring rite in which a vessel was blessed and set upon the water in her honor, marking the opening of the season of sailing. From the Greek world, her cult passed into the Roman, and there it spread across the breadth of the empire, from Egypt to distant provinces, carried by merchants and soldiers and sailors, honored in temples far from the Nile, and in mysteries into which the devout were initiated with secret rites of death and renewal. For a span of centuries, she was among the most far-traveled of all the gods of the old world, a delta goddess, grown into a power the whole Mediterranean knew. Then, slowly, the light of her temples dimmed. As Christianity rose across the Roman world, her worship waned, her festivals ceased, her shrines fell silent one by one, and somewhere in the long stretch between the 4th century and the 6th, her cult came at last to its close. Philae, remote upon its island, was among the very last to keep her, and when at length even that sanctuary was stilled, the ancient worship of Isis passed out of the living world into memory. What remains of her in the end comes down to us in fragments, and it is worth pausing on how little of it is whole. No single Egyptian text ever set down her story from beginning to end. The tellings are scattered and they differ, and to gather her tale is to piece together shards from many ages. The oldest lie in the pyramid texts, carved at the close of the 5th dynasty upon the walls of royal tombs, where she first appears in the mourning for Osiris. More come from the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, painted upon the coffins of a later age. There is the Westcar Papyrus, with its midwife at the births of kings. There is the Contendings of Horus and Set from the New Kingdom, with its long quarrel and its dark turn. And latest and fullest of all, there is a Greek treatise, the work of Plutarch, called On Isis and Osiris, which gathers the myth into a single connected account, such as no Egyptian source provides. Yet even that fullest telling must be held with care, for Plutarch was a Greek writing long after, and his ordered version may not faithfully mirror what the Egyptians themselves believed. The sources vary widely. In some, the body of Osiris is torn apart, and in others it is not. The detail of the lost genitalia comes from one strand alone. What seems a single story is in truth a shifting weave of many. Even her motherhood, which seems the surest thing about her, is not beyond question. There are signs that suggest Hathor, and not Isis, was first held to be the mother of Horus, the cow goddess whose horns Isis would later wear. Another old tradition made an elder Horus a brother of Isis and Osiris, rather than a son at all. It may be that Isis became the mother of Horus only as the Osiris myth took its shape in the Old Kingdom, that the bond we take as her very center was itself gathered to her over time, as so much else was gathered. The goddess we meet was assembled across the ages, trait upon trait, throne and horns, and milk and magic drawn together into one great figure. And here, the question that has walked beside this whole telling comes to its rest. It was asked at the beginning, wherein her power truly lay. This goddess said, to wield magic greater than that of any other god. The answer is not a single spell, not one word of might that unlocked every door. Her power was the gathering. It was grief, the true and sounding grief of the widow that would not let the beloved dead lie forgotten. It was love, the love that bent over a broken body and over a hidden child alike. It was cunning, the sharp turning of wit that won a crown before a tribunal of gods. And it was magic, the recited spells that drew breath back into the still and poison out of the wounded. No one of these alone was her strength. Her strength was that she brought them together and bent them all toward a single end, the renewal of order in a world that murder had broken. She was the one who gathered the scattered pieces of a body, of a kingdom, of a cosmos knocked from its balance and made them whole again. And so, before the story settles fully into stillness, let their names be spoken once more, gently, the way a keeper of an old temple might pass along a colonnade at dusk and touch each pillar in turn, not to wake anything, only to remember that it stands. Speak first the name of Osiris, the slain and risen king. He was the eldest of that last generation of gods, born to Geb the earth and Nut the sky, and to him passed the kingship of the living world. Picture him as the Egyptians pictured him, a figure wrapped from the waist downward in the linen of the tomb, wearing the tall Atef crown with its plumes, the pharaoh's plaited beard upon his chin, the crook and the flail crossed upon his breast. He was among the first of all the gods to be bound in mummy wrappings, and in that binding lay his strange gift. He was struck down, and he did not vanish. He went instead into the Duat, the hidden country beneath the world, and there he reigned, not over the fields of the living, but over the still multitude of the dead. He is the one who taught that an ending need not be an erasing, that a king may be laid in the ground and yet hold a throne. His stillness now is not the stillness of one forgotten. It is the stillness of one at rest, in his own kingdom, secure because an heir stands in the sunlit world above him. Speak the name of Set, the lord of the desert and of disorder. He was Osiris's brother, and he was the storm at the edge of the green land, the master of the red land where the barley does not grow. The Egyptians drew him with a creature no living eye has ever named, a beast with a curved snout and tall squared ears. The enigmatic figure the scholars call simply the Set animal. He was the bringer of violence and of the unruly, the god of foreigners and of the parching wind. And yet even he was not cast wholly out of the order of things. He rode in the bark of Ra as it sailed the night, and there he stood in the prow and drove back Apep, the serpent of chaos, keeping the sun's boat safe until morning. Hold him then without hatred, for the myth itself did not hate him simply. He was the disorder that must be met, the loss that enters every house, the brother whose hand undoes what other hands have built. His striving is spent now. Let it lie down in the sand of its own country. Speak the name of Nephthys, the mourning sister of the night. She was born of the same parents, the fourth of that generation, and her name means the Lady of the House or of the Temple. Her origin is unclear even to those who have studied her longest, and she moves through the story quietly, always near her sister, always in the shadowed places. Where Isis stood for birth, Nephthys stood for the experience of death, and the two of them together bent over the broken body of Osiris as its two guardians, one at the head and one at the feet. She is the goddess of the embalming chamber and of the lamp kept burning through the dark hours, of childbirth watched over in the night, of grief given its proper voice. In the great funerary laments, the two sisters wail together, their sorrow braided into a single sound. Think of her as the quiet one who does not leave, the keeper of the night watch, the sister whose weeping made the weeping of the world bearable because it was shared. Speak the name of Anubis, who tended the body. He was the jackal-headed one, the god who presided over the wrapping of the dead and the weighing of what a life had been. In the oldest reckoning, there was doubt about his parentage, and the scholar Hermann Tevelde raised the question of whether Set was ever truly his father, arguing that Osiris might be the father instead. Whatever his lineage, his place in this story is sure. When the pieces of Osiris were gathered, it was Anubis whose hands helped bind them. Anubis, who first performed upon a body the rites that would afterward be performed upon every honored dead in Egypt. The linen, the ointment, the careful ordering of the limbs, all of it took its pattern from that first tending. He is the one who made of grief a craft, who taught that love for the dead could become a steady work of the hands. Let him stand in the doorway of the embalming house, his task done, the body made ready for its long endurance. Speak the name of Horus, the falcon son who won back the throne. He was the child born in the marshes, hidden among the reeds, guarded through every danger of his infancy. The Egyptians drew him as a falcon, a lanner or a peregrine, keen-eyed and swift, or as a man with a falcon's head, and his earliest home was the town of Nekhen in Upper Egypt, where he was the protecting god of the place, before ever the great myth gathered around him. He grew from the vulnerable infant into the challenger of Set, and he pressed his claim to the kingship that murder had stolen, and before the assembled tribunal of the gods, with his mother's cunning at his side, he won it. In him, the broken line was made straight again. Every pharaoh who sat upon the throne of Egypt was named a living Horus, the falcon renewed in each generation, and every pharaoh who died became an Osiris in his turn. So the two of them, father and son, framed the whole span of a king's existence, the one below and the one above, the setting and the rising. And at the center of them all stands Isis, sister to Osiris and to Set and to Nephthys, wife to the slain king, mother to the falcon child, and the greatest magician among the gods. She wore upon her head the shape of a throne, the very hieroglyph that spelled her name. And long ago, the scholar Kurt Sethe proposed that she began as the throne itself made divine, the seat of kingship personified, while Henri Frankfurt saw in that throne the king's own mother lifted into a goddess. Others, Osing and Kuhlmann among them, have doubted that reading, finding the name and the word for throne less alike than the theory needs, so the origin remains unsettled, one shard among many that do not quite fit together. In later ages, she took to herself the sun disk cradled between cow horns that once belonged to Hathor, and by the telling of that borrowing, she had first lost her own head to the sword of Horus and worn the head of a cow thereafter. She was the midwife in the Westcar Papyrus who named 3 infants who would be kings, and in that naming, as Barbara Lesko observed, lay the sign of a power to see and to shape what was still to come. She was the one who searched the whole length of the land for a scattered body and would not rest until it was whole. She was the widow whose grief had a sound that could reach into death, the mother whose milk conferred the right to rest. She governed the natural world and fate itself, and the ordinary people of Egypt, who never ruled anything, called on her as the compassionate one, the healer, who would bend down to a sick child in a poor house as readily as to a king. These, then, are the figures of the recital, named once and let be. Osiris in his crown beneath the world, Set in his desert with the storm at his back, Nephthys at the night watch with her lamp, Anubis in the doorway with his work completed, Horus aloft on the wind above the reeds, and Isis at the center of the weave, holding the threads of all of them in her patient hands. Their long quarrel is finished, their searching is over. The body is gathered, the child is grown, the throne is restored, and the story, having traveled from the murder in the hall to the crown set right, comes down at last into quiet, the way the great river itself slows and broadens and goes silent as it nears the sea. Now let the mind begin to loosen its hold upon all of it. The tale has been carried a long way out of the oldest carved walls of the 5th dynasty, through the painted coffins of the Middle Kingdom, through the long quarrel of Horus and Set, out to the island temple of Philae that kept the goddess longest of all, and it does not need to be carried any further into the night. Let the marshes recede. Imagine the papyrus thickets of the Nile Delta far behind you now. The green reeds where the falcon child once hid. The still black water and the whisper of the wind through the tall stalks. All of it drawing away and growing small and dim. Let the underworld realm of Osiris draw away with them. The hidden country of the Duat, with its throne set in shadow, its sorrow and its striving no longer pressing upon your thoughts. The searching sister, the mourning sister, the murdered king, the desert brother, none of them ask anything of you now. Their grief has been spoken and heard, and it can be set down. In your mind, reach back toward that ancient realm of reed and river and shadowed kingdom, and take hold of a door set at its threshold. Draw it slowly closed. Feel it move on silent hinges, smooth and unhurried, without a sound, sealing the old griefs of Isis and Osiris away in calm and order. The murder and the long search and the difficult labor in the marshes, all settled now behind it, safe, complete, needing nothing more from you. The door comes to rest against its frame. The weight of that far country is on the other side of it, and it is still. And now, in the darkness before you, see a single candle. Its flame stands steady and upright, small and golden and unwavering, the only light in all that quiet. Watch it a moment, the soft edge of its glow, the calm that gathers around so small a fire. Then, with a slow and gentle breath, draw the air in softly and blow that candle out, and let the last curl of light fade into the night. Rest well, sleep deeply, and let the ancient stories carry you into the night.